Welcome. The following presentation was recorded at the annual Best Practices for Pollinators Summit hosted by Pollinator Friendly Alliance and the Xerces Society. Please consider participating in the annual summit next year. You can find more about the summit at pollinatorfriendly.org/summit.
Hi, everyone. My name is Hardy Kern. I am Director of Government Relations for American Bird Conservancy and our Pesticides and Birds campaign. And I first want to say thank you so much for the opportunity to come. I've learned so much from the last 3 days, but I think the thing that we're all going to take away most is that dandelion song, because that is not leaving anyone's head. And I also just want to say I'm still fairly new in this field, and it has been overwhelmingly joyful to get to know the different players and stakeholders in this space. The presenters we've had the last 3 days have basically been the slew of Oscar nominees in pollinator protection. So it's a really great field to be involved with. But jumping right in, today my talk is titled, "If it bugs bugs, it bugs birds." And I really wanted to highlight the impacts that pesticides and other practices can have on avian wildlife. And so just to start putting some things in perspective a little bit, this is a crazy looking map of the North American flyways. This is the 4 basically major bird highways that crisscross the United States. And if you look up at the top at the state of Minnesota, it's one of the few states that has 3 different flyways, 3 different migratory pathways that migratory birds go through in the United States. It's kind of the gateway to the country for a lot of different birds. It's really important habitat. So we're going to start with a little bit of a bummer. This is a stat that many of us have heard, I'm sure. There was a paper published in 2019 titled "Decline of the North American Avifauna," and my organization's president, Mike Parr, was one of the authors on the paper, and it documented that there are 3 billion with a B fewer birds today than there were in 1970. And this statistic gets morphed around a little bit. Every year there's a massive birth of birds, there's a massive die-off of birds, and that's just the circle of life. However, even factoring in those normal processes, we are down 3 billion birds from where we quote unquote should be. And granted, that's due to a wide variety of factors, but pesticides and the loss of habitat are probably are some of the biggest drivers. So this boils down to about 1 in 4 birds that have disappeared since 1970. There is a really lovely website that's built up all around this with great visuals like this. But 2 of this wide groups of birds that were heavily impacted I want to highlight today are grassland birds, things like meadowlarks that are down 53%. And as we've heard from the last 3 days, these are very much intertwined with lots of different important prairie habitats, plants, and pollinators that live there. And then the other group that I really want to highlight are aerial insectivores like swifts, swallows, martins, buntings. We are down 160 million aerial insectivores and 32% population loss overall since that same time period, 1970. And these numbers were analyzed by Doug Tallamy, the very well-known master gardener, in terms of how this might impact birds. And you don't have to read this whole quote, but what he looked at, instead of just these wide swaths of different bird populations, were just the diets of terrestrial birds. What are birds that live on land eating? And when he took those numbers in, he found that around 304 species declined in the amount of 2.9 billion birds. This is a better representation. This graph, it's insane to me. And this really speaks to the close ties between insects and the success of birds in North America. In species where insects are not essential to their life, there was actually an increase in population sizes. That's that tiny little bar on the right. And this has been confirmed by lots of other studies because we have seen recovery in waterfowl like ducks and geese and some shorebirds, gulls, herons, sandpipers, things like that. But in bird species that are dependent on insects, that giant bar on the left, you can see how low their populations have dropped. So this really speaks to just how important birds and bugs are to each other. And on day one, Scott from Xerces Society threw out this statistic, and it's one I want to come back to. 96% of all terrestrial birds eat insects. Now, if you're standing in your backyard and you're looking at your feeder and you see your cardinals and your buntings and robins coming up, grabbing seed, and you're thinking, well, do these birds really rely on insects? It can be a little bit tricky because when birds are migrating or when they are not rearing chicks, many species do rely on seeds and fruits and other things that they can eat. But most species of bird, when they are rearing chicks, feed them caterpillars, crickets, larvae, beetles, flies, you name it. So at some point in their life cycle, 96% of terrestrial birds are relying on insects. And you don't have to put it in the chat. I just want you to take a guess wherever you are. How many caterpillars will a single Carolina chickadee feed its nestlings before they fledge? So we're talking about just caterpillars. We're talking about one single teeny tiny bird, the Carolina chickadee, and just one clutch of eggs. 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars it takes for just one chickadee to feed one clutch of chicks. Think of how many chickadees you've seen in your backyard. Think of how many chicks they can have in a clutch. It's up to 8 at a single time. And think of all the birds that aren't chickadees that are much larger that also rely on insects. And there's been some more work done to look at what happens when there aren't enough resources for these birds. The study was actually continued on chickadees, and they looked at impacts on chickadee reproduction with lower caterpillar biomass available in their immediate areas. And what they found were smaller clutches, which means fewer babies, fewer eggs even being laid, more frequent mortality in nestlings from starvation. They controlled for predators, they controlled for wind events, they controlled for parents not returning, and looking only at starvation, there was higher nestling mortality. There were fewer fledgling offspring, which means fewer birds that actually made it to the age where they were able to fly out of the nest and rejoin the breeding population. And those birds had a lower body mass. This might not sound that serious, but that's the thing for ornithologists where they really, really get worried. Birds with a lower body mass have a harder time migrating. They have a harder time escaping predators. They have a harder time getting to a weight where it's healthy for them to reproduce. So a skinny bird is a bird that is in some trouble. And a lot of this boils down to impacts on insects and birds from pesticides. And as we've heard in the last 3 days, pesticides are pretty much ubiquitous in our society. We use them in our homes and gardens for insect control to keep our flowers looking pretty. We use them in our recreation facilities, such as soccer fields, lawns, golf courses, and then, of course, in our agriculture. They can be synthetic, they can be biological, they can be organic, and we use them all over the place. If you are registering or using a pesticide in the United States, at some point, it has been funneled through this giant piece of legislation, FIFRA, the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act. FIFRA is there to say what needs to go on a pesticide label. It's there to make sure that checks and balances are gone through by chemical registrants. It's supposed to be there to keep people and wildlife safe and not let really harmful chemicals come on the market. However, the way that FIFRA works is not as a protective piece of legislation. It's not like the Endangered Species Act. It is a cost and benefit analysis. FIFRA requires that chemicals are scrutinized under 2 different conditions. What benefits do they achieve, and what costs do they have to the environment, to human health, to wildlife? So it's analyzed for new chemicals or existing chemicals about every 15 years or so. What pests are they targeting? Will pests become resistant? Will they make our crops more affordable for people to buy at the grocery store? Versus, is it carcinogenic to people? What are effects on wildlife? How does it impact our waterways? And if there is a negative impact from a chemical, it doesn't mean that that chemical gets canceled or not registered or not renewed. It simply means that they circle back and say, but what are the benefits? What do we get out of using this? And if they feel like with some mitigation, those benefits can outweigh the costs, they very simply move it onto the market. So it is a system, unfortunately, that heavily favors the chemical industry and not so much wildlife and people that are supposed to be protected. And when we're talking about pesticidal impacts on birds specifically, there's three main ways that they're exposed. From ingesting pesticides, like tiny little granules that you might throw on a lawn, or seeds that are coated with a pesticide. They might get the chemicals on their feathers, their skin, or inhale them. And then they may also interact with a plant or an environment that's recently had a pesticide sprayed, or in the case of systemic insecticides, where the chemical is actually grown into the tissues of the plant. To put some numbers on it, and these are tragically out of date, unfortunately, you can see from the bottom, this was a USDA commissioned study done in 2005, 18 years ago. At least 67 million birds are lost to just pesticides every year. You can see the different causes there that might, contribute to that. But past the direct exposure, we have that insect loss that's associated. So birds lose important prey sources. They might have habitats that become contaminated with chemicals, and our agricultural systems, which at this point have become very closely intertwined with wild birds, might also have a lot of chemicals used there. As we've encroached more and more into our environment and expanded our food system, birds have made use of them. They look at them as areas to, look for food and nest alongside of as well. So one really interesting case study that we can look at in impacts on birds from the use of pesticides that might not be so direct comes from the Netherlands. This is from a very often cited paper from Casper Hallman in 2014. And he noticed that there seemed to be a major decline in common birds that you used to see around farmlands in his homeland. And when he looked at what could be causing it, you can see on the right there, he looked at the area of agriculture in terms of acres that was being farmed, what was being farmed, what nitrogen, how much nitrogen was being used, and also the use of this neonicotinoid insecticide called imidacloprid. And the only variable that was statistically significantly correlated with bird decline was imidacloprid concentration. So where in areas where the neonic was used, where there was higher concentrations of it, those are the same areas, you can see those red circles on that bluish map, those were the same areas where they saw bird decline. And what was interesting here is it's not that the birds were eating the pesticide necessarily, it's that there was prey loss. There wasn't enough food left over because all of the beneficial insects, the non-target, non-pest invertebrates were being killed by the same chemicals that were meant to go after the agricultural pests. I'm not going to go through this graph. This is just a really great representation of what happens when a chemical gets into the environment, especially a water-soluble chemical like a neonicotinoid or a highly drift-prone chemical like glyphosate or 2,4-D dicamba, things like that. One big use of neonicotinoids in the United States is as seed treatments. If you have bought corn that's not organic or soybeans, chances are very good that you've interacted with a product, whereas you can see on the left, those aren't Skittles, the actual seed itself has been coated with a neonicotinoid pesticide, as well as some other things, usually a fungicide, maybe some nitrogen in there to help a young plant grow as well. And when neonics were first put on the market, this is the timeline on the top graph here, they were supposed to replace a lot of the other really harmful, really nasty chemicals like chlorpyrifos, some of the carbamate insecticides. And you can see, even though they were introduced in '94, they didn't really get popular until 2004, and their use has just exploded since then. The bottom graph there is non-neonicotinoid pesticides. And even though neonics were supposed to replace everything else, you can see use of other chemicals continued pretty much unabated. The main advantage, supposedly, of neonics was that they were a lot more toxic in much smaller amounts, which means you could use fewer gallons of them in agriculture. You could apply less to your homes and gardens and still have a major impact. They were supposed to be better for wildlife, but we very much know that that's not the case. And just to talk about how toxic they are, a single seed coated with a neonic can kill a songbird. One kernel of corn with a neonic is enough to kill something the size of a red-winged blackbird. And there's enough active ingredient on one kernel of corn to kill 80,000 bees. I apologize if that point's already been made, but it's definitely worth repeating. And because they're so water soluble, it's very easy for them to travel into the environment. Talking about how important it is to know where these coated seeds are being used, this map was generated by the USGS, United States Geological Survey, in 2014, and this looked at clothianidin, a neonic that's used as a seed coating, and they were mapping where it was used as a seed coating and not as a seed coating. However, because of this weird loophole in FIFRA, that big law we talked about earlier, if you have a pesticide applied to the outside of a seed, it is no longer considered a pesticide. It is now an exempt pesticide, which means it's not subject to the same scrutiny that other chemicals have to go through. It became so difficult for the USGS to estimate where these chemicals were being used, because their use doesn't have to be reported or tracked like other pesticides, that in 2015, they just stopped, and it's understandable. So if you look, this is the map in 2014. In 2015, it looks like neonics disappeared completely overnight. However, as you can see, or as you know, hopefully you believe me, and as you can see from a lot of popular media, that's not the case. This isn't because we stopped using clothianidin. We simply stopped tracking where it was being used as a seed treatment. That's the only thing that's different. So in 2017, a fantastic group of organizations, this was well before my time at ABC, so I cannot take credit, got together and petitioned the EPA to say, we want pesticide-coated seeds to be treated like any other agricultural chemical. It took EPA 5 years to formally respond to that, and a lawsuit to get them to formally respond. And after that, in 2022, they came back and said, we still believe that pesticide-coated seeds deserve this special status. We're not going to change it. Instead, we're going to put up an advance notice of public rulemaking, ANPRM, which will hopefully address your concerns. But even that is, we don't know what's going to be in that text yet. And in the meantime, the use of neonic-coated seeds continues unabated. We also just recently submitted a petition to talk about neonicotinoids and their use as a seed coating. Right now in FIFRA, there's also a provision that says if you are registering a chemical or re-registering an existing chemical, you need to submit data that shows how water soluble it is, if it's carcinogenic, some different exposure pathways it has. You do not need to prove that it works. EPA can ask you for data that proves its efficacy, but that is not a requirement. That's from a 1984 Ronald Reagan era provision. And in the original release and the text of that provision, it literally says that pesticides will be approved with the assumption that they will work. You don't have to prove that it works. And so Public Employees for Environmental Responsibility and us authored a new petition. We had a lot of amazing groups, many of whom are represented over this conference, join us on that. And we're hoping to see systemic insecticides have to prove that they work before they are allowed to go to market. That would be massive, because a lot of research and studies have told us that neonics as seed coatings are not that effective and have enormous environmental impact in a very negative way. Another just emblematic lawsuit I do want to mention is a chemical called sulfoxaflor. It is another insecticide. It works very much like a neonic. It's systemic. And sulfoxaflor was approved for new uses without going through a public approval process. What that means is that new uses were approved without the public getting to weigh in, without us knowing what happened during that approval. So Earth Justice represented a few beekeeping groups, sued the EPA, and won their suit. The Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals came back and said that Sulfoxaflor has to undergo a brand new comment period. They need to be transparent in their processes. And as part of the ruling, this is what the judge said. I think it's really impactful. When an agency, meaning the EPA, deliberately ignores Congress's legislative command, it undermines the will of the people and ultimately our constitutional structure of government. So this is bigger than just chemicals. This goes into an agency's ability to comply with the laws that Congress has passed governing what it's supposed to do. And it's also very important because neonicotinoids, like we were talking about earlier, they impact species in ways that were not originally thought of when they were being cooked up in laboratories. For instance, the neonicotinoid imidacloprid shows high chronic toxicity to mayfly nymphs. Mayflies are a major food source for a lot of different bird species. So this all sounds pretty doom and gloom. What are we going to do? But I want to kind of flip things on their head a little bit and talk about birds in pest management scenarios, rather than being the victims, being partners that we can use. So can birds themselves be insect control? And the short answer is yes. There have been a lot of studies that have looked into this, but here's two of my favorites that I thought were very impactful. In 2011, there was a study that looked at California grape vineyards. And all that they did in their experimental plots was add nest boxes for bluebirds. When they added nest boxes, overall species richness, so not just bluebirds, increased by 50%. And not only were birds that were coming in eating, their regular prey, native insects, things like that, 2.4 times more live beet armyworms, which are a vineyard pest, were eaten in areas where they had these nest boxes. And in the same areas, there was a lot more live beet armyworm larvae removed, 3.5 times more removed in area where birds were given a habitat. There's another a long series of studies that have been done on California berry farms by Gonthier and a lot of his colleagues. And this is one of my favorite studies. They left up some natural buffer strips. They planted native vegetation. And their whole goal was just to see if we give more natural areas around large-scale factory-style agricultural production areas, can birds come in and help us out? And what they found was not only did more insectivorous birds, more birds that eat bugs, more birds that eat crop pests come in, those birds displaced birds that were coming in to feed on the strawberries. So birds were coming in, feeding on the fields, taking some of the crop. That's understandable. That's normal. That's just how life goes. But when they added more natural habitat, some of those frugivorous birds were being displaced by the natural insectivores, and it was giving a really great platform for birds to come in and do their jobs. And what I think is really important about these studies is it looks at birds being part of the solution, but not the perfect solution. So often in, big pest management, large agrochemical companies, they advertise that they want zero pests. We think that growers need to manage for zero pests on their farms, for zero crop loss. That's fantastic. That's a great goal to shoot for, but it's very, very hard to achieve. So rather than saying, I want zero pests, I want zero impact, think about how much you can economically afford to lose and then manage around that. And that gets into integrated pest management principles, which I'm a proponent of. I'm certainly not an expert on them. I'm just the bird guy. So what can we do in the meantime? Because there's a lot going on here. We've heard some amazing take-home practices from the other presenters over the last 3 days. Number one is avoid neonics and other broad spectrum insecticides because they have so many unintended consequences. And like we were just talking about, use integrated pest management as often as you can. If you are experiencing a pest problem, try to use biological controls, use your wild neighbors like birds and beneficial insects to try to get rid of them, use mechanical controls. And if you do need to use a chemical to get rid of a pest, make sure that you are using it as responsibly, as highly targeted, and in as small amount as physically possible. We want to make sure that we're minimizing these non-target organism impacts. Employ alternative practices. We've heard tons. I don't even need to go into detail on that. And the other one, and because I'm a policy wonk at ABC, vote for wildlife and call your representatives. With Pollinator Friendly Alliance, where it's based, I do want to highlight a few different pieces of legislation specifically. Tell your representatives to vote yay on HF 2472 and HF 1317. Both of these are bills that would improve the way neonicotinoids are registered and regulated in the state. It closes those federal loopholes. It calls for efficacy data requirements. It protects people and wildlife. And then also the Highways for Habitat bill, which Lori and I both testified on. She did a great job representing Pollinator Friendly Alliance to lawmakers, HF 718. It's great for birds. It's great for bees. It's great for pollinators. And just in closing, I'll leave this slide up and I'll try to take a few questions if there's time. This is an seemingly insurmountable problem that we have because pesticides are everywhere. But in every other case, the problems that humans have caused have also had human solutions. And unlike a lot of other disasters that humanity has faced, we have a ton of allies in this one. We have birds, we have beneficial insects. This whole conference, we've learned how to work with nature to conquer these pests and to solve these issues. So I really like our chances given who and what we're working with. So thank you so much. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And if there's time, I will take a few questions.
Thank you, Hardy. Yes, we have time for some questions. So thank you for that great talk. We had so many comments while you were talking about how awesome this was. So the first question is, insecticides are evaluated for their impact on bees. Are there equivalent issues with FIFRA evaluation for bird impacts where they're with bees, they're looking at honeybee effects and not at native bees? Is that an issue that comes up with birds?
Absolutely. Phenomenal question. And I'll even take it a step further with bees in that they tend to look at them in laboratory settings and not in field settings. And so those are very different sets of scenarios. There are birds that are used as test subjects, but it's always bobwhite quails, mallard ducks, and if you're really lucky, a chemical might be tested on zebra finches to represent passerine birds. These are birds that are easily managed in laboratories, which is why they're used as test subjects. However, bobwhite quails and mallard ducks are not representative of all bird species. If you're lucky enough for a chemical to have gone through those tests, you might have some mitigations put in place, but just to give an idea of what type of testing they do, for a chemical to have been officially tested and approved by EPA to look at chronic effects or long-term effects from a chemical, how long do you think that the test subject has to be exposed to the chemical? The answer is 14 to 20 days. So chemicals that are used for months at a time that may persist in an environment for years are considered to be tested for chronic impacts after 14 to 20 days. So definitely similar impacts that we see on birds.
Wow. Yeah. Did not know. So I know that mosquito sprays kill Lepidoptera. What's the effect on birds?
Great question. It depends on the specific chemical. There's everyone's favorite answer. It depends. Usually with mosquito sprays, it depends on if it's a bacterial spray. It depends on a lot of the organophosphates are also very, very bad for birds. But when you take out lepidopterans, those are major food sources for a lot of birds, especially their larvae. And so that does tend to have cascading effects on populations. One of my favorite alternative strategies for mosquito control is actually being deployed in Hawaii and a few other places. And it is a pesticide that doesn't kill the mosquitoes. It actually makes their larvae unable to grow wings. That's one interesting one. There's also a new genetic strain of mosquitoes being released that are sterile. So they're releasing mosquitoes into areas that are already infested with the idea that if you get enough sterile individuals in the population, over time that population will collapse. And there is no secondary risk to any organisms from a control like that.
Yeah. Wow. So this might be, I might be opening a can of worms with this. I know you can handle it, Hardy.
We'll see. Let's see. Bring it on.
So there's this avian virus going around, and some folks keep birds, right? So, and then there's regulations that limit wild birds in farms for food safety. Can you speak to that?
I can a little bit. So that's a little bit outside of the pesticide realm, but I work on a lot of different bird policy, so that's something that we've been focusing on as well. The virus, I believe that they're referring to, is called highly pathogenic avian influenza, HPAI. And what's a little bit weird about this recent strain of it is it doesn't seem to have any impacts on songbirds or crows. It has enormous impacts on waterfowl like geese and ducks, on domestic birds like chickens, and then weirdly enough on raptors like eagles and hawks. And so, yeah, basically keep checking your state's websites. I will say there's been a phenomenal concerted effort between U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the APHIS under USDA, and all of the state agencies. Maps are kept very up to date. I would love to see a similar effort be put toward pollinator conservation and curbing pesticidal impacts. But yeah, HPAI is something very much to take seriously. And I also think that it speaks to the need to guard and mitigate against these known quantities, these known risks that we have. Pesticides that are used every year in our gardens, in our homes, in our farms, we know that those have negative impacts on birds. And we are always going to have random disasters and events that happen, like HPAI, like this horrible train derailment in Ohio, things like that. There's always going to be accidents. There's always going to be the thing you can't predict. So in the meantime, let's aggressively mitigate the risks that we do have, the threats that we do know about.
Great. Any final comments?
I have learned so much. It's been such a joy to attend the last 3 days. And thank you all so much for your interest and for the opportunity to speak. And if anyone has questions or follow-ups, please feel free to reach out to me.